Great. So I'm going to talk about the developments that have happened during the past decade and what we can anticipate from the technology during the 2020s, and also what one can do to influence to speed up the cure for aging, what is actually going on. So despite that we are still in the COVID pandemic for over a year now, the past 10 years have been better than ever. Extreme poverty in the world, it has reduced by more than 50%, and the 28% of all the wealth in the history of humanity has been produced, measured by GDP. And there have been multiple advances in biotechnology, and the world is a safer place than ever. And Sweden, the country where I come from, where we have very good statistics, we can see that 92% of people reach age 65. So aging is really becoming the major cause of death. And transhumanism is becoming the global megatrend of the 2020s. The management group Frost and Sullivan, who do business surveys, they have seen that the major megatrend of this century is likely to be transhumanism and being able to combat disease and enhance our physical functions. And in the biotechnology field, there have been many advances outside of direct aging research. For example, the first gene therapies hit the market, and the CAR T cells immunotherapy that won the Nobel Prize, and the checkpoint inhibitors as well for cancer research. And there has been a major progress in the research tools. For example, improvements in DNA synthesis, nanopore sequencing, sRNA sequencing, and machine learning. These are techniques that were not as common until very recently, and that has the potential of making biotechnological research go a lot quicker than ever in history. And the AI, there's a big interest in AI right now. Big Pharma is putting in a lot of resources in it. And in 2020, over $2 billion were raised by AI startup, and it has never been like that previously. However, this is also challenged by the fact that bringing a drug to market costs a lot of money and also time, but this could also be sped up by AI. And the insights in life at the molecular scale have improved a lot. For example, modeling protein structures, that is the basics in any biological research to fundamentally understand biological aging on a small scale. And then we have the rise of the longevity biotech industry. Calico is obviously the biggest player here in this field, but also BioH have raised well over 100 million, and as well as UNS's AI. And we have more companies than ever that are being formed in this area. So it is now an investable area which didn't exist only 10 years ago. And especially the concept of being able to remove senescent cells and induce a partial rejuvenation is something that was discovered in 2011 and has really changed the field a lot, because it is proof of principle that you have old people with senescent cells and they get sick from it, and if you clear them out, they get generally healthier. So we know that this is a major concrete fundamental mechanism in aging, and if we reverse it, which we can do right now in the lab, we are able to get life extension and positive health outcomes from that area. So now this is a big field within rejuvenation biotechnology. However, the prognosis in the absence of intervention is not very good. The rates of cancers, dementia, and bone fracture is going to go up, not so much because by itself, but because we have more and more people reaching an advanced age when these things start mattering a lot, because we have wiped out all the infectious diseases and so on that occurred earlier in life. So if we do not intervene, we will have a major economic catastrophe in society. And another inconvenient truth of aging research is that you're able to easily extend life a lot in simple organisms like worms and flies, but it gets harder and harder when you get into more complex organisms like mice and rats, and then humans. So this graph here shows that the body is constantly producing damage. You start with a non-aged body as a clean square here in A, and then you get some damage, and the body repairs that damage, but it doesn't repair it perfectly, and it systematically builds up until you are essentially the whole body is like a damaged scar, you could argue, in a way. And then we try to treat this with things that only modulate the symptoms, like statins for high cholesterol and blood pressure medications for high blood pressure, but that doesn't really change the underlying causes. And changing this represents a major shift in aging research. So a major grade here is to be able to find the best panels of aging biomarkers to know that anything that we are doing is modulating aging itself. So it would need to be a biomarker to identify something that has to do with aging that you can intervene in, and that you can have a marker to assess a better health outcome based on this. Because, for example, when you see these two people, they look very different, but they might have the same blood pressure, for example. But when you go into more deep biomarkers, you will be able to find things like epigenetic and proteomic shifts that really makes it easy to identify how aged a person is, and how can we rejuvenate them and make them less aged, and how do we then measure that rejuvenation. And aging is an accumulating process. So when it comes to mortality, it's essentially flat until the mid-40s. You can easily tell that someone is 40 or 20, but the damage in the 40-year-old is still not big enough to result in a high risk for mortality from cancer and heart disease and so on. But after mid-40s, it goes up a lot. So by 80, 90, it is many times compared to just at 60, 65. And the reason for that is also that the different hallmarks of aging that we talk about, aging has been defined as 9 different hallmarks. Of course, one can argue that that is not fully complete, but it's reasonably complete at least. And those hallmarks accumulate at roughly similar rates, and they feed back upon each other. So intervening in just one of them will not produce necessarily a lot of life extension. Because this is something that is intrinsic to the organism by itself. So a mouse might live 2 to 3 years, but a human nearly always live to like 80, 100, because these hallmarks overlap and feed back upon each other. So that's why you don't see any exceptions, someone with a gene that makes them live to 150, for example. So the oldest people that we currently have in the world, they age clearly slower. They age much slower than the average person. They live to 110 to 120, but they don't age slower compared to each other. So we can see here that there are almost 2,000 people validated to have lived to 110. Validated. Of course, there are many more that lack birth certificates, but only one of them have reached 120. So that shows how the ultimate killing aging disease is not that different in the oldest old. And by the way, here is me with the world's oldest person, who is 117 in the picture. So in order to crack that ceiling, we know that we have a 98% mortality between the ages of 110 to 115, and that's well established. So any intervention that we would rapidly be able to see if it affects mortality, it will need to be implemented in the oldest old if we are going to very quickly be able to see a change in the mortality rate. So of course, it will be very hard to conduct such a study to track the oldest people in the world and intervene in them, but that will produce the most rapid data for knowing that an intervention against aging itself actually works. And that will be a robust proof of principle, because the most deadly form of brain cancer, that's a glioblastoma with a 95% mortality rate. But being 110 years old is even more dangerous, because then you have a 98% mortality rate. And if we manage to show evidence that we can exceed this cap of 110 to 115, then that will rapidly show that we are affecting multiple parameters of aging at once in a human. And it translates to a life extension. And so, which routes would then be pursued now during the 2020s that could yield the most benefit? Well, we have several things like ECM aging. I will go into this very briefly, and the Lipofossil and the treatment of the proteostatic collapse and immunosenescence prevent future pandemics for COVID. In the proteostatic collapse, you have Alzheimer, for example, you have protein aggregations in the brain that are due to dysfunction in aging, and then you have transthyretin amyloidosis that accumulates in the heart. So that's like a protein junk that is the most common direct cause of death in the oldest old. But now with much better understanding of proteomics, like when we build a human protein atlas, then we can much more easily map what types of more protein pathologies there are in the body that limits lifespan. And there are also several companies going on this field, for example, Covalent Biosciences and Eidos Therapeutics. And then we have Lipofossil, that is not studied a lot. We have one company working on this, Lysoclear, where I have been working earlier, and they aim to clear Lipofossil from the eye, but it's also accumulates in the brain and heart and other cells that do not divide. So we actually don't know how it contributes to aging, but we know that it's a major marker of aging. And then we have, of course, immunosenescence. Nearly everybody who dies from COVID is over retirement age. And then I published a paper quite recently where I argue that the atrophy of the circadian clock in the brain is a major player when it comes to biological aging, because it will affect all the circadian rhythms across the whole body. So it leads to disturbed sleep and a higher risk for cancer, among many other pathologies. So what I think is likely to happen this decade, there will be a successful trial in humans with a longevity drug, like TAME trial. And I think there will be an approval of a longevity drug. And I think there will be an expansion of the aging codes in the ICD. And I think there will be a much better understanding and possible proof of principle in animal studies of several aging hallmarks. But the question is, how do you get it to humans? Because that's only the major difficulty is not only all the basic scientific research, but also being able to translate it into a product that works in humans and to reach the market with that. And that's often quite underestimated how difficult that actually is. So we will need to then climb the Mount Improbable. We can say we will never reach beyond about 120 naturally. So if we have a person lives to 130 and we have intervened in the aging process, we can for sure proclaim a victory. So say thank you. Use the 2020s well for aging research. Your future depends on it.